In the winter of 1925, the residents of Hollow Springs, Ohio, thought the arrival of telephone lines would bring their small town closer to the modern world. They never imagined that some calls would come from the dead. Every night after midnight, the phone rang at the central exchange, and the voice on the other end whispered names of people who had been buried for years. The operator who answered these calls would soon discover that some secrets in small towns are buried so deep that even death cannot silence them. Before we dive into the chilling mystery that plagued this quiet Ohio town, if you're fascinated by real mysteries from America's past, make sure to subscribe to Dark Heritage Files and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the country's most haunting secrets. Give this video a like if you're ready to uncover the truth, and let us know in the comments what city and country you're listening from. We love hearing from our global audience of mystery lovers. Now, let's return to that cold January night in 1925, when everything changed. According to the fragmented records and whispered accounts that have survived from that time, the terror that gripped Hollow Springs began with a sound that still haunts the memories of those few who remember. Hollow Springs sat quietly in the rolling hills of southeastern Ohio, a town of barely 3,000 souls, where everyone knew their neighbor's business and strangers were noticed before they reached Main Street. The year 1925 had brought unprecedented change to this rural community. The Bell Telephone Company had finally extended their lines to Hollow Springs, connecting the town to the outside world with a network of copper wires that hummed with promise and possibility. The telephone exchange occupied a modest brick building on Maple Street, its windows glowing warmly through the winter nights. Inside, a single operator managed the town's connections, routing calls between the hardware store and the church, the doctor's office and the farms that dotted the surrounding countryside. It was honest work, respectable work, the kind that allowed a young woman to support herself in an age when such opportunities were rare. Sarah Mackenzie had taken the night shift at the exchange in November of 1924, grateful for the steady income and the quiet hours that allowed her to read between calls. At 24, she possessed the patience and clear voice that made her perfect for the job. Her supervisor, Mrs. Helen Patterson, had trained her well in the art of connecting calls, the proper phrases to use, and the importance of maintaining the privacy of conversations that passed through the switchboard. The Morrison family had been Hollow Springs' most prominent residents for nearly 2 decades. James Morrison owned the First National Bank of Hollow Springs, a substantial brick building that anchored the town's small business district. His wife, Eleanor, was known for her charitable work with the Methodist Church, while their teenage son, Thomas, showed promise as a student at the local high school. The Morrisons lived in a grand Victorian house on Elm Street, its gabled roof and wraparound porch marking it as the finest residence in town. In 1919, the Morrison family had simply vanished. One morning in late September, James Morrison failed to open the bank. When concerned townspeople went to check on the family, they found the house empty, personal belongings scattered as if the family had left in great haste. The local sheriff, a man named Deputy Walsh, had conducted what he called a thorough investigation, but no trace of the Morrisons was ever found. The bank was eventually taken over by a consortium of local businessmen, and the Morrison house stood empty, its windows dark and its gardens overgrown. The harsh winter of 1925 had been particularly brutal in southeastern Ohio. Snow lay thick on the ground from December through February, and the wind that swept down from the Great Lakes carried a bite that seemed to penetrate every building in town. The telephone lines, strung on wooden poles that marched across the frozen landscape, swayed and creaked in the constant wind, occasionally snapping under the weight of ice and leaving sections of the town temporarily cut off from the outside world. Sarah had grown accustomed to the rhythm of night work. Most evenings brought only a handful of calls. Doc Miller summoned to a difficult berth, the volunteer fire department alerted to a chimney fire, or the occasional long-distance call from a worried relative in Cincinnati or Columbus. The work was peaceful, allowing her to pursue her love of reading while remaining alert for the distinctive ring that meant someone needed to make a connection. The first call came on January 15, 1925, at exactly 12:23 a.m. Sarah had been reading a novel by the pale light of her desk lamp when the switchboard's bell rang with the sharp, insistent tone that indicated an incoming call. She reached for the appropriate jack and spoke in her trained, pleasant voice. "Hollow Springs Exchange, how may I help you?" The line crackled with static, the kind of interference that plagued calls during winter storms. Through the electrical noise she heard a voice, barely a whisper, distorted by the primitive technology of the time. The words were unclear, but they seemed to be calling a name. Thomas. Thomas Morrison. Sarah's blood ran cold. Thomas Morrison had been the teenage son of the family that had disappeared 6 years earlier. She pressed the receiver closer to her ear, straining to hear more clearly. "Hello? This is the telephone exchange. Are you trying to reach someone?" The whisper came again, more distinctly this time. "Thomas Morrison. Tell him we're waiting." The line went dead with a sharp click that seemed to echo in the small exchange office. Sarah stared at the switchboard, her hands trembling slightly as she removed the jack. She checked the board carefully, but no lights indicated an active connection. According to the equipment, no call had been placed. She tried to dismiss the incident as a prank, or perhaps a crossed wire that had somehow picked up a conversation from another town. But the voice had been so clear, so urgent, and the name it had spoken was one that carried particular weight in Hollow Springs. Sarah made a note of the incident in her log, writing simply, 12:23 a.m. Strange call, possible crossed wire. The next night, at 12:23 a.m. exactly, the phone rang again. This time, the voice was clearer, though still distorted by static. "Eleanor Morrison. Eleanor, can you hear me? The men are coming. The men with the papers." Sarah's heart hammered as she recognized the name of Thomas Morrison's mother. This time, she was prepared. "Who is this? What number are you calling from?" But again, the line went dead, leaving only the hollow silence of the empty exchange. Sarah checked her equipment thoroughly, testing each connection and examining the board for any sign of malfunction. Everything appeared to be working perfectly. She spent the remainder of her shift in a state of nervous tension, jumping at every sound from the street outside. On the third night, the pattern continued. At exactly 12:23 a.m. the phone rang, and this time the voice spoke a name that made Sarah's blood freeze. "James Morrison. James, they found the documents. They know about the loans. You have to run." The calls continued every night, always at the same time, always lasting less than a minute. Sometimes the voice was clear enough to understand, other times it was just a whisper lost in static. But always, it spoke the names of the Morrison family members, delivering fragments of what sounded like urgent warnings or desperate pleas. Word of the mysterious calls spread through Hollow Springs like wildfire. Sarah, despite her initial attempts to keep the incidents private, found herself the center of attention in a town where news traveled fast and speculation grew even faster. Some townspeople suggested the calls were an elaborate hoax, perhaps perpetrated by someone with access to telephone equipment. Others whispered about more supernatural explanations, remembering the Morrison family's sudden disappearance and the many unanswered questions surrounding their fate. The mysterious calls had shattered the quiet routine of Hollow Springs, creating an atmosphere of unease that seemed to permeate every conversation and gather in every corner. Sarah found herself the reluctant center of attention as townspeople approached her after church services and in the grocery store, all wanting to hear firsthand about the voices that spoke from beyond. Mrs. Patterson, the daytime supervisor at the telephone exchange, had initially been skeptical of Sarah's reports. But as the calls continued night after night, always at precisely the same time, she began to take the matter more seriously. She arranged for the regional telephone company to send a technician to examine the equipment, but the man found nothing wrong with the switchboard or the lines. During the long winter days, Sarah found herself thinking constantly about the Morrison family. She had been only 18 when they disappeared, old enough to remember the shock that had gripped the town, but too young to understand the full implications of their vanishing. Now, as she listened to the desperate whispers night after night, she began to wonder if the official explanation for their disappearance had been too convenient, too simple. The Morrison house on Elm Street had stood empty for 6 years, its windows boarded up, and its once beautiful gardens choked with weeds. The property had been seized by the county for unpaid taxes, but no buyer had ever been found. Townspeople claimed the house was cursed, that strange lights could sometimes be seen moving through the rooms at night, though no one had ever been brave enough to investigate. Sarah decided to visit the town's small library, housed in the basement of the Methodist church, to research newspaper accounts of the Morrison disappearance. The librarian, Miss Agnes Fletcher, was a spinster in her 60s who had lived in Hollow Springs all her life and remembered the incident clearly. "Such a tragedy," Miss Fletcher said, pulling out a folder of yellowed newspaper clippings. The family was so prominent in the community. James Morrison was not just a banker. He was a pillar of the church, a member of the town council, and a supporter of every charitable cause in Hollow Springs. The newspaper accounts from 1919 painted a picture of a family that had simply vanished without explanation. The sheriff's investigation had concluded that the Morrisons had likely left town to avoid financial difficulties, though no evidence of such problems had ever been found. The bank's books were in perfect order, and the family's personal accounts showed no signs of distress. "But there were rumors," Miss Fletcher continued, lowering her voice as if the empty library might contain hidden listeners. "Some people said James Morrison had been asking too many questions about certain business deals, that he had been investigating loans that were made under suspicious circumstances. There were whispers that he had discovered something that powerful men in the town wanted to keep secret." As February settled over Hollow Springs with its burden of snow and ice, Sarah's nights at the telephone exchange had become an ordeal of anticipation and dread. The calls continued with mechanical precision, arriving at 12:23 a.m. every night without fail. Sometimes the voice was clear enough to understand complete sentences, other times it was just fragments of words, lost in static and interference. One particularly clear night, the voice delivered a message that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "The papers are hidden, behind the loose brick, 3rd row from the bottom. Tell the authorities. Tell them about the signatures." Sarah had begun keeping detailed notes of everything she heard, filling a small notebook with her careful handwriting. The messages seemed to be fragments of a larger story, pieces of a puzzle that spoke of hidden documents, forged signatures, and men who came in the night with threatening intentions. The more Sarah learned about the Morrison family's final days, the more convinced she became that their disappearance had been no voluntary departure. Miss Fletcher had shared additional memories of the weeks before the family vanished. How James Morrison had seemed increasingly worried, how he had been seen in hushed conversations with his wife, how they had stopped attending their usual social functions. "Mrs. Morrison came to the church the Sunday before they disappeared," Miss Fletcher recalled. "She seemed frightened, kept looking over her shoulder during the service. After the hymns, she pulled me aside and asked if I knew of anyone who might be traveling to Cincinnati or Columbus in the coming weeks. She said the family might need to visit relatives suddenly. But the most disturbing revelation came from an unexpected source. Old Pete Crenshaw, who had worked as a handyman around town for decades, approached Sarah one evening as she walked home from her shift. Pete was known as a man who kept to himself, someone who saw everything but said little. "You're the girl who's been getting them strange calls," Pete said, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "I heard things back in 19 that I never told nobody. Things about the Morrison family." Pete explained that he had been hired to do some repair work at the Morrison house in the weeks before the family disappeared. While working in the basement, he had overheard heated conversations between James Morrison and several prominent men from town. Conversations that suggested Morrison had discovered financial irregularities involving the bank and certain loans that had been made to local businesses. "Mr. Morrison was a careful man," Pete said. "He kept records of everything. And he was asking questions about loans that had been approved under his name, but that he claimed he never authorized. He seemed to think someone was using his position at the bank to move money around, to approve loans that should never have been approved. Pete had also noticed something else: construction work being done at the Morrison house, specifically in the basement. James Morrison had been installing what appeared to be some kind of electrical equipment, working late into the night with tools and materials that seemed far too sophisticated for ordinary household repairs. He was real secretive about it, Pete remembered. Told me it was just telephone equipment, said he was trying to get a private line installed, but it looked like more than that to me. Looked like he was setting up some kind of recording device. The revelation about James Morrison's basement project sent Sarah's mind racing. If Morrison had been installing recording equipment in 1919, could those recordings somehow be connected to the mysterious calls she had been receiving? The technology existed. Thomas Edison had invented the phonograph decades earlier, and more sophisticated recording devices were being developed for business use. Sarah knew she needed to investigate the Morrison house, but the thought of entering the abandoned building filled her with dread. The house had been empty for 6 years, boarded up and left to decay. But if Pete's memory was correct, there might be evidence in the basement that could explain both the family's disappearance and the source of the midnight calls. She decided to approach Deputy Walsh, the man who had investigated the Morrison disappearance. Walsh was now the town's sheriff, a position he had held for 3 years. He was known as a competent lawman, though some townspeople whispered that he had been too quick to close the Morrison case without finding definitive answers. When Sarah knocked on the door of the sheriff's office on a cold February afternoon, she found Walsh behind his desk, reviewing paperwork. He was a man in his 50s, with grey hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of dealing with the problems of a small town. "Miss Mackenzie," Walsh said, looking up from his papers, "I've been hearing about these telephone calls you've been receiving. Quite a mystery, isn't it?" Sarah explained her theory about the connection between the calls and the Morrison family's disappearance. She shared Pete's recollections about the basement construction and her own growing conviction that the family had not left town voluntarily. Walsh listened carefully, his expression growing more serious as Sarah spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, drumming his fingers on the desk. "The Morrison case was one of the most difficult investigations I've ever handled," he finally said. "We found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no indication that the family had been forced to leave. But I'll admit, there were aspects of the case that never sat right with me." Walsh revealed that he had always been troubled by the condition of the Morrison house when it was found empty. While it appeared that the family had left in haste, certain valuable items had been left behind: jewelry, silverware, and other possessions that a family would normally take if they were fleeing financial difficulties. "And there was something else," Walsh continued. "We found evidence that someone had been in the basement recently, but we couldn't determine who or why. There were scratches on the floor, as if heavy equipment had been moved, and some of the electrical wiring looked like it had been tampered with." Walsh agreed to accompany Sarah to the Morrison house, though he warned her that the building was in poor condition and might be dangerous. They arranged to meet the following evening after Sarah's shift at the telephone exchange. The night of their investigation, the temperature had dropped well below freezing, and a thin layer of ice covered the streets of Hollow Springs. Sarah met Walsh at the sheriff's office, and together they walked through the quiet town to Elm Street. The Morrison house loomed before them, its dark windows and snow-covered roof giving it an ominous appearance. Walsh had brought a lantern and a set of tools to remove the boards from the front door. As they entered the house, their footsteps echoed in the empty rooms, and their breath formed clouds in the frigid air. The interior was exactly as Sarah had imagined: furniture covered with dust sheets, wallpaper peeling from the walls, and the musty smell of abandonment. They made their way to the basement, Walsh leading the way with his lantern held high. The basement was larger than Sarah had expected, with stone walls and a concrete floor. In one corner they found what they were looking for: a complex arrangement of electrical equipment, wires, and what appeared to be some kind of recording device. "Well, I'll be damned," Walsh muttered, examining the equipment. Pete was right. This is definitely more than just telephone equipment. As they studied the device more closely, Sarah noticed something that made her heart race. The equipment was connected to a series of wires that ran up through the ceiling and, presumably, to the telephone lines outside. If the device was still functional, it could potentially access the town's telephone system. Walsh found a switch on the recording device and, after a moment's hesitation, turned it on. The machine hummed to life, and they heard the crackling sound of electrical activity. Then, clear as day, came a voice that Sarah recognized immediately. It was the same whisper she had been hearing every night at 12:23 a.m. But this time, they could hear the entire message, not just fragments distorted by the telephone line. The voice belonged to James Morrison, and he was speaking rapidly, urgently, as if he knew time was running out. The recording device crackled to life, and James Morrison's voice filled the basement of the abandoned house. His words were clear, desperate, and filled with a fear that had been preserved in the mechanical memory of the strange contraption he had built. "My name is James Morrison, and I am recording this message on September 20th, 1919, at approximately 11:30 p.m. If anyone is hearing this, it means that my family and I are no longer able to speak for ourselves. I have discovered evidence of a conspiracy involving several prominent members of our community, and I believe our lives are in danger." Sarah and Sheriff Walsh stood transfixed as Morrison's voice continued, his words echoing in the cold basement air. The banker's tone was measured but urgent, the voice of a man who understood the gravity of his situation. "For the past 6 months, I have been investigating irregularities in the bank's loan records. I discovered that my signature had been forged on numerous documents approving loans totaling more than $50,000 to businesses owned by Mayor Richardson, council member Thompson, and hardware store owner Bill Henderson. These loans were made without my knowledge or approval, and the money appears to have been used for personal enrichment rather than legitimate business purposes." The recording continued, revealing the full scope of the conspiracy that had been hidden for 6 years. Morrison had documented his findings meticulously, recording conversations, copying documents, and gathering evidence of the fraud that had been committed using his name and position. I confronted the men involved 3 days ago, demanding that they repay the money immediately or face criminal prosecution. They asked for time to consider their response, but I now believe they intend to harm my family to protect their secret. Eleanor is packing our belongings, and we plan to leave for Cincinnati tomorrow morning to present our evidence to federal authorities." Sarah felt her heart pounding as she realized the true horror of what had happened to the Morrison family. They had not fled town to avoid financial difficulties. They had been preparing to expose a conspiracy that involved some of Hollow Springs' most respected citizens. "I have installed this recording device as a precaution," Morrison's voice continued. "It is programmed to activate automatically if the telephone lines are disturbed in a specific way, and it will transmit portions of this message through the exchange at predetermined intervals. If you are hearing this, it means that something has prevented us from reaching Cincinnati." Walsh's face was grim as he listened to the recording. The implications were staggering. Not only had the Morrison family been murdered, but the perpetrators had been living freely in Hollow Springs for 6 years, some of them holding positions of authority and trust. The recording provided specific details about the location of Morrison's evidence, documents hidden behind a loose brick in the basement's east wall, exactly as one of the fragmented telephone messages had indicated. Walsh immediately began examining the wall, and within minutes he had located the hiding place. Behind the brick was a metal box containing dozens of documents, forged loan applications, bank records, and copies of correspondence between the conspirators. The evidence was overwhelming, clearly documenting the theft of more than $50,000 from the First National Bank of Hollow Springs. "There's more," Morrison's voice said, as if anticipating their discovery. "I have reason to believe that Deputy Walsh, who investigated our disappearance, was either incompetent or complicit in the cover-up. The evidence of foul play would have been obvious to any competent investigator." Walsh's face flushed with anger and shame as he heard Morrison's accusation. "I was young and inexperienced," he said quietly, "and I was under pressure from Mayor Richardson and the town council to close the case quickly. I should have looked harder, should have asked more questions." The recording revealed one final, chilling detail. Morrison had arranged for his device to begin transmitting messages 6 years after the family's disappearance, believing that enough time would have passed for the conspirators to feel safe and for new people to be in positions of authority. The midnight calls had been his way of reaching out from beyond the grave, using the new telephone technology to expose the truth. The evidence found in the Morrison basement led to one of the most shocking criminal cases in Ohio history. Within days of the discovery, Sheriff Walsh had arrested Mayor Richardson, council member Thompson, and hardware store owner Henderson. All 3 men eventually confessed to their involvement in the bank fraud, though they maintained that they had not intended to harm the Morrison family. The truth, as it emerged during the trial, was even more disturbing than Morrison's recording had suggested. When the banker had confronted the conspirators with his evidence, they had initially tried to negotiate, offering to repay the money in exchange for his silence. But when Morrison refused and threatened to expose them, they had panicked. On the night of September 21st, 1919, the 3 men had gone to the Morrison house, intending to steal the evidence and force the family to leave town. They found the Morrisons preparing to depart for Cincinnati, their belongings packed and ready to go. A confrontation ensued, and in the violence that followed, all 3 members of the Morrison family were killed. The men had buried the bodies in a remote area outside of town and then returned to stage the scene at the Morrison house, making it appear that the family had left voluntarily. Deputy Walsh's cursory investigation had played perfectly into their hands, allowing them to escape justice for 6 years. Sarah's role in uncovering the truth made her a local hero, though she took little satisfaction in the acclaim. The midnight calls had stopped immediately after the recording device was discovered, as if James Morrison's mission had finally been completed. The telephone exchange returned to its normal quiet routine, and Sarah found herself able to work her night shifts without the dread that had plagued her for weeks. The Morrison house was eventually sold to a young family who renovated it completely, erasing the last physical traces of the tragedy that had occurred there. But the story of the midnight calls became part of Hollow Springs folklore, a reminder that some secrets are too important to stay buried, even in death. Sheriff Walsh, deeply shamed by his role in the cover-up, resigned from his position and left town. He was replaced by a younger man who promised to bring more thorough investigative methods to the job. The 3 conspirators were sentenced to life in prison, where they spent their remaining years paying for their crimes. Sarah continued working at the telephone exchange for several more years before marrying and moving to Columbus. But she never forgot the winter of 1925, when the voices of the dead had spoken through copper wires and mechanical devices, demanding justice for crimes that had been hidden in the shadows of a small Ohio town. The case of the Morrison family demonstrated that in an age of rapidly advancing technology, even the dead could find ways to make their voices heard. James Morrison's ingenious recording device had bridged the gap between past and present, using the town's new telephone system to expose a conspiracy that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. In the end, the very technology that the conspirators had thought would protect them from discovery became the means of their downfall. The midnight calls of Hollow Springs serve as a reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, even when it has been buried beneath years of lies and deception. Sometimes it takes only the ring of a telephone to bring the past rushing back into the present, carrying with it the demands of justice that can never truly be silenced. This chilling case from 1925 shows us that some mysteries transcend time itself, finding ways to demand justice even from beyond the grave. The Morrison family story reminds us that in small communities, the line between trust and betrayal can be dangerously thin, and that those in positions of power must be held accountable for their actions. What do you think about this incredible story? Do you believe James Morrison's ingenuity in creating a device that could expose the truth years after his death? Have you ever experienced anything mysterious involving old technology or unexplained phone calls? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe to Dark Heritage Files and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our investigations into America's most compelling mysteries. Give this video a like to help us continue bringing you these incredible stories from the past, and share it with someone who appreciates the darker chapters of our history. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows of Hollow Springs. Until next time, remember that the past is never truly silent. Sometimes it just needs the right technology to make its voice heard again.